All right. Well, because we are live on Facebook and YouTube today, which is a first for us for our webinars, we'll go ahead and get things kicked off right on time. And since this is being recorded anyway, we are certainly able to share if you should join a few minutes late. So welcome to what I believe is our 12th or maybe even lucky 13th webinar of the year. All year long, we have been bringing recovery webinars to you, to our audience based on best practices and principles related to a variety of things from workforce to economic development. So I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, which is supposed to be about successful American Rescue Plan spending. And so hopefully we're able to get some tools and tips and tricks out to our audience today. So I want to welcome everybody. My name is Andrea Hutchins. I am Vice President at Thomas P. Miller and Associates. And I do have the distinct honor of being your moderator, which means that I probably don't have to answer too many questions, which is a great place to be in during a live Q&A. But I am pleased to be joined by two fantastic guests, both of who are, I believe, repeat panelists out of our 12 or 13 or so webinars. So I have Luke Basso, who is a Managing Director of Government Consulting at Katz Sapper & Miller, and Brittany Dougherty, who is a Senior Consultant at Thomas P. Miller & Associates, and I believe has become a recent professional ARP panelist member. So if you need somebody for your webinar, I think she's for hire. So before I officially allow Luke and Brittany to tell you a bit about themselves, I do want to point out just a few key items. We are, as I mentioned, live on Facebook and YouTube. So if your friends want to join and maybe didn't get a copy of the Zoom link, they're welcome to do so. We generally keep our webinars to right about an hour. So people should be able to be prepared to leave right around 4 p.m. We do have some moderators who are going to be monitoring our Facebook as well as our YouTube. So we'll be looking for questions there, but are really encouraging our audience that is joining on Zoom to make sure that you use the chat function, the question function. We'll make sure that we're keeping track of those questions. I do not have a ton of questions planned for our audience, and or for our panelists rather, and while I can make them up, it would definitely be helpful to have them come from you all. So while we wait for a few questions to populate the queue, I'd like for both Luke and Brittany to introduce themselves, tell us a little bit about what they do and their background. So Luke, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. And I think not only am I a repeat panelist, but over multiple mediums now, because I've done the podcast, I've done this. Real. So, a regular of the TPMA multimedia adventures. So hi, everyone. Luke Basso. As Andrea said, I'm the Managing Director of Government Consulting here at Katz Sapper Miller, KSM, as we refer to it. Fairly new to this position and a new practice here at KSM. Prior to being here, I was the Chief of Staff of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation in the Governor Eric Holcomb administration. And then prior to the IEDC, I was the Senior Operations and Policy Director for Economic Development, Workforce, and Infrastructure directly in Governor Holcomb's office. I was also on the economic recovery team for the state of Indiana during the pandemic. So became really familiar with CARES Act and now ARPA dollars. So excited to be here, excited to help with information we can. Primarily at KSM, we focus on project management and government compliance. So really looking forward to being here.
Well, I know that compliance is on the top of everybody's mind. And Luke, I feel like we need to get like an SNL jacket to give you or something for the next webinar that you attend. So
Perfect.
Anyways, yeah, absolutely. All right, Brittany, would you mind telling us just a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. Thanks, Andrea. My name is Brittany Dougherty, and I'm a senior project consultant with TPMA in the workforce development area. And so I've been in workforce development for almost 20 years between my time at TPMA and State Workforce Agency. Primarily, I work with state workforce boards and local workforce boards on a variety of projects, from strategic plans, policies, WIOA plans, technical assistance, training, one-stop operations, and everything in between. But as Andrea mentioned, over the past few months, almost even a year, we've been really trying to help clients navigate this flood of federal funding and understanding what it is, what they can do with it, and how it's different from some of the funding they've been used to. And so we're happy to be here and want to help answer any questions you have and share what we've been seeing and hearing across the country. Thanks, Andrea.
Awesome. Yes. No, thank you for being here, Brittany. So I don't see any questions from the chat yet, which is fine. We did actually ask a few folks ahead of time to kind of tell us what their major concerns were. And so I'm going to go through some of those briefly, just kind of reminding our audience, this the American Rescue Plan Act was actually just passed in March of 2021. It was the second largest ever stimulus package next to the CARES Fund stimulus package. So putting all of those together in a 3-year period means that there is a lot of money out there. Luke and Brittany and I were actually chatting via email before the webinar kicked off about just the fact that there is so many communities who are either returning funds or there is still unencumbered funds out there. I think I saw in one article that there's still $10 billion in unspent CARES funds, and I think it's due to be spent by the end of this year. So kind of mind-boggling when we talk about $10 billion that, it's just hanging out there. So unprecedented times, to be sure. So one of the questions that we got was to understand kind of navigating the gray areas. And I'm going to pick on this one first because I think this is part of the reason that a lot of communities have talked about not spending their funds is because there are so many gray areas that it makes it really difficult to come up with ideas and figure out how to put the funds to use in a, one, allowable way, and two, impactful way. So, Luke, I know that when it comes to the allowable piece and the reporting piece, that's kind of where your sweet spot is. So do you want to maybe touch on that first and talk about some of the allowability, is that a word, or compliance issues that you're seeing repeatedly?
Yeah, I mean, I also like to remind people, and we kind of touched on this with CARES, right? There were 3 or 4, rules and regulations around the CARES Act before we finally got to the final one. And I'll go out on a limb here. I'm guessing for the American Rescue Plan Act, we haven't seen the final version. There'll be tweaks along the way because, in all of this, right, you want to be fiscally responsible as you go out and spend the dollars. And if communities are confused or hesitant to really make impactful investments, then you're going to have $10 billion, left over, which now, as we all see in Washington, it's become a political football and not a good thing. But on the compliance area, I understand the hesitancy of communities. I receive a lot of questions, now it's like, hey, was the Indiana Department of Transportation going to allow this, or is this going to do this? Is this going to do this? And I remind people at first, they're in the same bucket. You can tell I'm new. I refer to the state as we're. I'm no longer on that team. But they're in the same bucket in a lot of those situations as trying to understand what the compliance is. I think they have that broad catch-all language, right, as affected by COVID-19, which could be a lot. And then obviously there's the infrastructure improvements that people can make. But when you come to that, there's the question on if you dig up a road and put in broadband, is that still an eligible expense in the American Rescue Plan Act, which I would say it is. And judging from other compliance people I've spoken to, they also agree. But you need to have the conversations and need to document it. I think at the end of the day, there'll be some flexibility in the compliance. But I think if you're doing one-offs and saying, hey, this thing over here, this new water park, was affected by COVID, we're going to do it, and there's no documentation to match up and those type of things, I do think the federal government will come and ask questions. But I think if you're responsible in it, you don't create new fiscal cliffs, you work on the infrastructure, water, sewer, broadband, you are getting the money out to the community in the right way, such as grant programs. I do think the federal government will give you flexibility, but you have to take the responsibility as a community, hire a great partner who will document that and show everything that you're doing around.
That is great advice, Luke. And honestly, I think, 9/10 of compliance, right? It's documentation. I think that these, the funds were administered in such a way and the language was written in such a way around the funds that they really are encouraging people to think outside the box. But I think the lack of, or the ambiguity of the rules in general is causing the opposite effect to occur, where people are, just kind of trying to be protective and making sure that they don't do anything wrong. So, Brittany, how about you? Do you have any thoughts on that particular question?
Yeah, so on the workforce development side, unlike focusing on infrastructure, on water, sewer, those things, we're talking more about addressing the negative economic impact to individuals. And so, but I agree with Luke that even though those are kind of different areas, the documentation's key. So thinking about, how are you collecting data for the programs that you're implementing? Who are you serving to provide that equitability, focus? Are you serving those with the greatest need and the most need? Are you reaching underserved communities or neighborhoods? So again, I agree with him that, the data and documentation are key to say, this is what we've been doing with the funding and this is the impact we're having.
Absolutely. And this is how it goes back to CARES, or not CARES, but ARP funds, right? And the COVID pandemic in general. I think any government agency would be hard pressed to say that something wasn't related to COVID today, right? So it is just kind of going back to that documentation. So another question that we had was, how does an individual, I'm assuming that this could be somebody who works for a city or a county government, help their community leaders understand what the money can be used for? So we kind of talked a little bit about the compliance issue, but if I am a local government employee, whether I work for workforce, economic development, et cetera, how can I kind of approach my local elected officials and make them feel comfortable in the idea that I have? So Brittany, I'll let you go first this time.
Can I put a plug in for for our guidebook or blueprint that we put together?
Oh, yeah.
I think, maybe we can make that available after the webinar, but on our website, we have a really short, succinct, clear summary of here's ARPA funds, here's kind of the priorities and objectives. I would say that's a great starting point for somebody. It's easy for people to digest and understand kind of the intent behind the funding and how the funding's flowing. I think that's part of the challenge too. Again, I'll speak more from the workforce side. Is understanding kind of what local cities, counties, what their processes are for the funding, or even at state level. We've seen some states that just kind of allocated all their funding to workforce development boards and gave each board a allocation, and then they're able to do it. And then, for city counties, there's different processes about putting together proposals for county commissioners or city county councils. And so I think that's really hardest to navigate, like what the local process is. So I would say, start with our guide and some of the other great resources you can find online that summarize the funding, and then try to figure out where the funding is locally within your municipality, who's kind of holding it, and if they have any processes in place yet. But I'd love to hear Luke or other perspectives.
Well, that's $1 million question a lot of times, Andrea, right? How do you get elected officials, to do things that you want them to do? I think the first thing is realizing there's a lot of money out there, right? I think the thing when I was still at the state, we would get a lot of people that reach out and say, hey, spend the money on this or spend this money on that. And then the response would be back like, well, that falls under family and social services. They have money. Right. So now you're trying to intermingle the money, which then adds to more and more confusion. So I think the first thing is, if you want to do this type of project and you think it falls under ARP, maybe check and make sure there's not additional funding out there already. Because the worst thing that can happen to any elected official is they go talk to somebody about something and they find out that's not what it is. I think in Indiana, we've seen some of the, I don't know if confusion is the right word, but you have this found money, right? There's all these great projects that you want to go do, and then you don't want somebody to say, well, no, you can't do it. So the General Assembly appropriated, Indiana's version of the ARP dollars, which may or may not be able to be used the way they want them to. So once you get through those hurdles, right, which are pretty big, having a plan to talk to the mayors or talking to the counselors and really laying it out, showing that there is a data-driven approach to it. One thing that I like to harp on people about, if you have successful programs, just continue to fund those. Don't go create 6 new programs and create 6 new fiscal cliffs, that doesn't look good for any community, doesn't look good for any elected official. And then I think if you're in the ear of elected officials, they're here right now, having them temper their expectations too. We know everybody everywhere needs new housing, right? Housing stock is it's like workforce in a lot of ways, right? You have to have a great workforce, got to have a place for them to live. Whether or not that falls under the ARP guidelines, probably not. But it's people want to build that stuff, so making sure those expectations are there when you go talk to the elected official will go a long way in those conversations as well.
So many different side conversations that I could take that down. So, obviously we all want to know the secret sauce, right, to getting things passed through local and elected officials. But you all both hit on some key points that I think could navigate into some other conversations. One of which we did have somebody ask how to approach spending that will provide the greatest impact for the community. And given that many communities haven't spent their funds at all yet, the assumption is they're trying to be impactful and creative. Do you all have any recommendations on how you can kind of like look to the future, look more long-term for the greatest impact of the way that you're going to spend your funds? I'll let you guys fight over who goes first on this one.
I unmuted first. Spending 4.5 years with the state budget director, he would probably want me to go with a very conservative, right? Stick to the guidelines as much as possible. Figure out ways to not create fiscal cliffs, and then move on with your money, right? Fund your departments. That's a little boring to me. So I think we have great opportunities as communities to work with our business leaders to figure out what the next 10 years of these regions, of these communities look like. And as economic development officials, you're always out talking to businesses, you're always out talking to elected officials. Ask them what's next. I've used this example a few times. I was talking to a small to medium-sized community, and they said, "Hey, we're going to create we're going to use the federal dollars to create a cybersecurity hub." They're about 25 minutes or probably about 25 miles from a metropolitan area. And I was like, "Great, if that works, what stops that metropolitan area from doing the same thing?" And they're like, "Oh, nothing." Right. So, your businesses are what's going to ultimately grow your community. So you should be talking to them and asking them about, hey, what are investments you can make, or you as communities can make to help them? What's going to be the next expansion for them? What's going to be the next tier 2, 3, or 4 supplier that can move in because of investments, because of infrastructure, broadband, sewer, those type of things. I think we all have this perception that certain leaders make decisions on their own. This is an opportunity to really go out and get community buy-in to figure out what's the next best thing for your area.
Absolutely. Thank you. How about you, Brittany?
Yeah, I'm in full agreement. Things we've been talking about with clients is, if you have a strategic plan, pull out that strategic plan. What were your priorities?
List.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
As a state, as a community, economic development. If you have a strategic plan, that should be driving what you want to focus on in the future. Again, thinking about what Luke said, where do you want to be in 10 years? So the strategic plan and what those priorities are, I think, are key. Thinking about what you've wanted to do, but haven't had the funding to do, or the funding you have is too restrictive to do that. So those are all things that we've been encouraging is, but also I think balancing what Luke said too, is that financial cliff. So how will you sustain it beyond this funding? So, those are kind of the things we would think about as the strategic plan, priorities, sustainability, and then what, have you wanted to do that you haven't had the funding or flexibility to do?
Yeah. And we're getting hired from a lot of communities who, they want to do sort of like a community resiliency and recovery plan. So taking that strategic plan that unfortunately some folks just finished in like 2018, 2019 and putting the COVID impact spin on that. So I definitely think that the communities that implement something like that are going to not only use their funds smarter, but I think that they're going to be more competitive in the long run because they're going to have that competitive edge, right? So no, good points. Something else that made me think about the whole partnership piece of things, so when we look at spending, or not spending, but like applying for other types of funding, right? Like EDA funding or funding that's out there through DOL or even different grants, everyone is encouraging partnerships. Partnerships are like the big key word right now. I think a lot of communities don't realize if there's 3 cities in a county or a county next to another county that has ARP funds, those funds can be pooled together for a greater purpose, for a greater use. Are you all seeing those type of things? Or are you hearing a lot of trepidation from communities who don't want to put those funds together? Is that an issue? What are your thoughts about partnerships? Go ahead, Brittany.
I was going to let Luke win the mute war again, but yeah, I think, this is a challenge. Everywhere we go, we talk about collaboration and coordination and working together. People say they do it, but it may be at a surface level. And that's just even, within a county or a community, not even thinking cross-county collaboration.
Right.
I don't know. I think people are thinking about it more, trying to figure out how to do it better. And I think you're right. These grants are helping make that happen. They're coming together to write grant applications. But I think as we started this, we talked about the challenges of figuring out what you can do with the money and how to access it and how to make requests locally. So that challenge is multiplied when you're involving multiple counties or multiple regions working together. So I'd love to hear what Luke has to say.
Well, a former colleague of mine always used to say that the line separating counties or cities or towns are invisible, and even states. And I think, one of the things we did here in Indiana was we launched our READY program, the Regional Economic Development Initiative. I just totally butchered the letters there, but encouraging regional collaboration. It really struck me when I went to the IEDC, especially as we were attracting international talent, how people outside of the United States think of they think of cities and they don't think of regions, right? So in the Midwest, it's Chicago. And if they don't go to Chicago, then they're going to go look at, now it's Nashville or Charlotte or New York or LA on the West Coast. And we were meeting with an international group. And they don't know that. And one day the governor had mentioned Chicago, and the person asked, how close is Indiana to Chicago? We're like, we're right next door. And it really dawned on me. We need strong, regions, whether it's a strong Midwest or a strong multi-county relationship or strong city relationship. And Andrea's heard me say this a ton. If the worst thing that came out of Indiana's READY initiative is that a bunch of regions came together and created a plan, that would be fantastic. And it's happened, right? 18 regions in Indiana, all creating these plans. And I think that the evolution of that is Southeastern Indiana talking to Ohio, Northern talking to Michigan, so on throughout it. But the thing that we all have to keep, limiting our expectations, the mayor of whatever town in Southeastern Indiana can't be the mayor of Cincinnati, right? And the mayor of Cincinnati has priorities. All elected officials have priorities. So it's going to take a wholesale philosophical change to get to, and maybe not wholesale change, but some philosophical change from leaders to say, it's okay if Lebanon is doing really well and my community is doing better, right? They don't have to be the same, but we need leaders to realize that strong regional collaboration really benefits everyone. And if somebody lives in Indianapolis and works in Zionsville, that's just as good as somebody, doing the vice versa than not living in the region.
Absolutely. The rising tide argument. It's not one that many economic developers use, Luke. So that competition is often there among communities. So one of the other things that you all brought up, in addition to creative funding uses, is the ability for pass-throughs. And that actually was a question that we received. Specifically, they asked about how do you advance funds to grantee organizations. So whichever way that you all want to talk about this could be, I can't really tell the way that the question was asked, if they're discussing it from a government sending it to like a nonprofit or another local government agency, or if they mean something different. But anyway, so the question was advancing funds to grantee organizations. And so I think I just want to make a point there that for those that don't know, ARP funds are eligible to be passed through directly to nonprofits and other types of governmental entities, like utilities and things like that. So Luke, I saw you unmute. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, we had direct experience of this at the IEDC, but we were also limited by legislation that we couldn't directly pass funds through to a business. So we had to create a partnership with organizations to help us pass through the funds. IEDC was ultimately in control. Then they have a third party organization pass it through. And, we keep talking about fiscal cliffs too. And I want to use this opportunity to say we also, like, fiscal cliffs can be bringing on employees. Just, I think we all know that, but we don't also bring that together. So shameless plug for probably TPMA and KSM here. Our organizations are here to help you get through and be comfortable with funds being passed through, making sure they're getting in the right hands, and then the compliance aspect of it, right? So you have to get you have to make sure that the right money is getting there, it's being used the right way, and all those types of things. So I would encourage you in this environment to reach out and have those types of conversations to make sure that you're comfortable with how it's getting passed through, and then the results coming back from it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I started hitting on this during the initial part of the webinar, but the Pew Research folks came out with an article, I want to say 3 weeks ago, that was discussing how many communities were actually sending their ARP money back to the federal government. I think it was last count 141 communities had sent back their funds, and the majority of them were citing the fact that they didn't know how to use the money. So, understanding that is sometimes a direct issue related to the number of staffers that they have or the experience of the staff. While we joke about the shameless plug for the consultant, sometimes bringing in somebody from outside of your community, even if it's another leader from a nearby community, if you don't have the money to hire a consultant or you don't believe in consultants or something like that, there's other resources that you can go to get ideas, because there certainly is some creative uses of funds. So Brittany, do you have any thoughts on that particular question before we move on? No. Okay. So our TPMA moderator did also ask for those that are in the chat or on the Zoom call to definitely let us know, is there a way that your community is looking at using ARP funds, or how are you currently using ARP funds, that we can maybe answer a direct question about whether or not something could be allowable, or what types of uses for regulatory compliance, et cetera, you might have questions on. So continuing to look through our questions. Somebody did ask, understanding program dollar allocations. So my direct response to that would be, there's a lot of FAQs out there. Some of them are very, very lengthy, but the guidance itself is very lengthy. My personal recommendation would be try and go directly to the Treasury and see if you can understand the Treasury guidance before, going to other outside sources. And then, beyond that, obviously, there is the traditional Google or ask a consultant. So Luke or Brittany, do you guys have any thoughts on how folks might be able to learn about funding allocations other than maybe going directly to the source? Any thoughts? No. Okay. So go to the source, FAQs, and Google the heck out of it. All right. So one of the other things that I want to talk about just a little bit. So we talked about pooling funds together and using funds for programs that are successful. I want to dig into that just a little bit further. And Luke, since you brought this up, I'm going to start with you. So I know you're welcome. So sometimes there are communities that are spending funds on existing programs that are ARP eligible. So instead of trying to create new programs, I think what you were alluding to before is you could use ARP funds to offset your community's budget, take out that existing budget allocation, or just don't spend that existing budget allocation out of the general fund and use ARP funds to pay for it instead. Use those general funds for something else, either this year, next year, cutting, taxes, the whole 9 yards. But it sounds like there's a number of variety of ways that you could use ARP funds to take the load off of general funds. What were your thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think you can think about it in two ways. The way you just described it, right? We have a successful workforce program. We have a successful small business grant program, right? Whatever it may be. And we know this is a eligible use for the ARP dollars. Let's put these funds in, and then let's go utilize the other funds on maybe a mixed use development or something else. Or what you could do is you could extend the life of your program, right? So you have really good data that backs it up. You see these great successful results, and now you take a program that you may only have funding until 2024, and now you have funding until 2027, right? You have to move some things around, all the stuff that your controller or CFO can do. But I don't think there's a lot of intent, right? And I'm never going to try to get in the position to say I know what the federal government's thinking. But I think common sense would tell you the intent of this is not to go create a bunch of programs that in 2024 we're all like, well, hold on, these are really successful, we need a bunch of money now. Or the opposite, right? We've created all these programs that were terrible because we only had a certain period of time to do it and we rushed to do it. If you have good programs, fund to good programs. Andrea knows this. I did a lot of PPE purchasing, personal protective equipment during the pandemic, and we put a quote on our wall that said, if it was a bad deal before the pandemic, it's a bad deal now. And it's similar. This is a very similar philosophy for this as well. If you wouldn't have done it before, don't do it now. Think through it and utilize the funds in the best way for your community.
That's a really good point, Luke, especially if it was a bad deal before. So speaking of intent, Brittany, I think this might be an area that you might be able to chime in on here just slightly, but I want to kind of tweak the question a little bit. So a lot of communities found themselves completely unprepared for the pandemic. I don't think that that's a shock or a secret to anybody. We had unemployment systems that were getting hacked. We had funds that were not getting out the door, going to the right people. It was chaos. So is there a way, kind of going back to Luke's earlier point, that we can, using the intent of what the ARP funds were established for, spend those funds in a way that prepares our workforce system for the next emergency?
Yeah, certainly some states are using it to kind of update, enhance their unemployment systems. But others, as you said, even outside of unemployment, our American Job Centers were shut down, but they still needed to serve individuals. And so they had to quickly, go virtual with their services. And so, they've made those adjustments, but we've seen many of them are continuing those investments using ARPA funds. So continuing to allow or, set up online workshops, virtual services, increasing learning management systems, all of those things. So making sure that individuals have greater access, it's easier to access services that addresses some of our community's needs on, transportation, childcare, other things that were problems before on, taking time and the effort to get to the American Job Center and encumbering some of those challenges. Now they can log on from home at any time that's convenient for them and receive those, workshop, career coaching, counseling services. So I think, fixes to some of the state's unemployment insurance systems, but also service delivery for American Job Center customers has been some technology enhancements we've seen coming from ARPA. And other states are, again, we've talked about this, really investing in infrastructure and broadband, which, connects to the workforce development system, but also education and everything else that we've noticed as our world went virtual for several months.
Absolutely. It's all about connectivity, right? And one of the things Brittany brought up, shameless plug here, man, we're doing this a lot today, but we actually did just start a broadband arm of TPMA. We have a couple of recent new partners that we brought on board to be able to help with that connectivity piece. So shameless plug for that. But before I go to the next question, I did want to let folks know we do have a question from the audience. It says, I represent a nonprofit organization that will be applying for ARPA funds via our metro government. Although the city will be awarding dollars, would we be responsible as a nonprofit directly to the federal government, i.e. will we get reimbursement via Uncle Sam or the Metro? So Luke, do you want to take that one?
Yeah.
I think they're just asking, go ahead.
Go ahead, because I think I know what they're asking, but the reimbursement part threw me off a little bit. You're on mute, Andrea.
Sorry, I hit the wrong button. So I'm guessing what they're asking is whether or not they are going to have to pay back any funds that may be misused or,
that's how I took it as well. And if,
that's what I was going to say, Janie, if you had a different way of asking that, or if we're misinterpreting that, definitely ask again. Go ahead.
So it's a yes, maybe question. So Janie, from depending on the program that the metro area is set up, they are ultimately the ones that are responsible for administering the dollars and making sure they're held accountable to the federal government. However, if they're doing this correctly, they're going to have you fill out a contract. And if it's funding over any period of time, they're going to ask for results and data to this. So, it's kind of one of these 2 or 3 pronged approaches. The metro area or the government you're working with, they're responsible to the federal government. If they're doing this in a responsible way, which I'm sure they are, you're going to be responsible to them. So if you do a contract with them and an organization misuses the funds, I would imagine that city or state government will then come and say, well, hey, you owe us this XYZ amount back. But I would really encourage you as you're going through the contracting portion of this to see what you're responsible for. Make sure the program you're submitting is compliant. Right. We can always, it's like the old tax evasion joke, right? Just because you didn't know you had to pay taxes doesn't mean you're innocent of that. Make sure that, I don't think anybody ever intends to misuse the funds, but I would make sure that you guys protect yourselves in the contracting portion, really spell out what you're going to use the funds for and all that jazz. But the city or state government will ultimately be responsible to the federal government.
One of the things I think a lot of folks misunderstand too when it comes to the compliance piece, and Luke, I'm going to let you kind of keep talking just a little bit more about this, because I know when the CARES funds were allocated, this was a huge issue for a lot of municipalities where they thought that those funds could not be used for planning. They thought that those funds could not be used for the administrative costs that those funds took to expend, nor the compliance. People truly thought that they could only be used for like the intended end user, right? Like, so if it was for healthcare, only used for PPE, not understanding that if you're going to have to hire a full-time person to purchase and distribute PPE, that salary is eligible. So can you talk to us a little bit about the compliance piece of expending funds and actually reporting on funds? Did I miss anything there?
No, and you're absolutely right. Administrative costs are part of the program, right? We saw this at the IEDC with our grants program, the PPE, all this different stuff. In fact, I was probably one of those people that I was like, oh, we can use these dollars towards this. And as we sat down with the budget director and all those different things, I had an understanding. So I would tell you that any program you do, compliance, and administrative costs should absolutely be factored into it, whether or not that means a little bit of a plus up in what you receive, or you set aside 2 to 3% to make sure you're doing that. But, it's at the end of the day, some amount of money on an audit is much better than having to go try to find it later. So have those contingency funds there, and work with a good reputable firm to make sure you're getting all your answers.
Absolutely. Thank you. So one of the kind of, I guess, common themes for most of our questions is how do I use the funds? I think people are really looking for creative answers on how they can use funds. So, Brittany, I am going to pick on you just a little bit more from the workforce side. I know that we have seen funds being used for anything from paying apprentices directly, from workforce organizations, et cetera. From a workforce side specifically, or even like education or economic development that you want to get into, what are you seeing that's a more creative use of funding for ARP funds?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, and this kind of goes to what Luke said, do a continuation of what you've been doing. Honestly, that's what we've been seeing. And granted, many groups are still in the planning phases. So, they're planning what they're doing for the funding, but they haven't actually. So I guess just broader and not necessarily addressing the creative question, but we're seeing an emphasis or focus on credentialing, short-term credentials, certifications, completing degrees, lots of focus on upskilling, focus on targeted industries and those that have been greatly impacted, either those that, maybe hospitality, entertainment, tourism, but also maybe high growth, high demand for an area, IT, healthcare, seeing really just like upskilling individuals for those areas. Grants for small businesses, for training, for technical assistance are also happening. I think more, this is kind of more of a societal thing too, but more focus on reaching underserved populations and communities and really going, I guess this maybe is more creative, going to them, meeting them where they are, not expecting people to come to us for service, but really how can we connect with these communities and serve them on a wide scale or perspective. So not just helping them find a job, but making sure their housing, childcare, transportation, food, all of those things that are mental health, education, those are all kind of a comprehensive support system to individuals. And that comes back to the collaboration and partnership are some of the things we're seeing. As you mentioned, there's been more emphasis on apprenticeships. And then the apprenticeship side of things, it's more looking at kind of different industries for apprenticeships. So not going with our traditional registered apprenticeships, but thinking about how can we do IT or healthcare apprenticeships and what those could look like. Continuing youth services and figuring out how do we serve our youth, how do we get them work experiences, how do we expose them to different careers and connect them to our community. So we've seen a focus on young people as well. So again, I don't know if it's anything terribly creative that we've seen, but continuation, expansion of some things that are good with a focus on serving some of those with the greatest need and typically underserved in some of our communities.
I will say, though, I know that they're probably not super creative for you, Brittany, because you work in this industry, but not everybody is used to the government paying for additional K through 12 workforce education, training, apprenticeship opportunities, right? Like there are some political and philosophical differences that are kind of impacting, who spends the funds and what they spend them on. I think another non-traditional use of government funding could be childcare, right? And so taking those non-traditional uses, but putting those funds to work in a long-term impactful way, obviously does take creativity and it does take some outside of the box thinking. One of the things that I will just pick on, I was recently up in Madison, Wisconsin, driving down the road, and I saw this brand new childcare co-working place that was just recently opened. That's completely ARP eligible, from the building itself to the pay of the employees that are in there. Those are the type of things that once something like that gets staffed and funded and starts working and has a self-sustaining fee structure to it, is going to avoid that cliff that you and Luke were just talking about a little bit ago. So they can be creative uses of funds. And I definitely think in those communities that's a non-traditional way of spending money, that could be very, very helpful. So
I guess there's a couple, I guess I would, I'll highlight. Yeah. So one is a city, I won't name the city, but they kind of went back to the idea of the new jobs program. And so they're focused on making their city cleaner, greener, safer, and more welcoming. And so they have a program where they're paying, $15 per hour, really focused on, kind of cleaning up the city and making it more hospitable to visitors. And the participants are receiving a salary, getting work experience, learning some skills. So I thought that was kind of neat to, really focus on kind of improving their city while also doing job training program. The other one that I think is kind of interesting, and I've heard a couple places do this, is more like subsidizing wages for residents that were impacted by COVID. And it's kind of a talent attraction, but also, potentially pulling individuals from other cities or communities by saying, hey, come work here in our city. And if you're a resident, you'll receive this, the employer will receive this subsidy. So that, I think that's an interesting way to encourage kind of that talent attraction, talent retention.
Well, if you're Topeka, Kansas, you can give people a year of free Jimmy John's. So I'm not sure that that's ARP eligible necessarily, but there are definitely some outside of the box things occurring to attract talent right now. Go ahead, Luke.
I'm going to add, I think, right, as you go through some of these programs, I can totally see state legislators or mayors or certain people saying philosophically, we don't agree with that. Right. And right or wrong, we're not here to debate that part. But if you are on that philosophical part, there's probably no better way to spend this money if you're on that side than figuring out ways to start new businesses in your community. That is 0 to 5 year business starts, we know go a long way within your community. It helps with revenue, right? They're paying taxes, they're doing those type of things. I think as we're all out in, you may say, hey, that's too creative for me, right? or we don't have the team, we don't have the staff, we can't do different things, which, by the way, these are great ideas, and I hope more communities do implement them. There is a path of least resistance, which is getting the money out into the community. And I would encourage anybody that knows any community that's giving the money back to stop. Right? Like, don't do that. There are ways. Governor Mitch Daniels used to say that, he never liked federal dollars. He was one of the biggest opponents of it. But he never gave it back because it was money they had at that time, and you never know when you're going to get it back. So if creativity is your barrier, there are plenty of traditional ways to have this money being impactful for you and your community.
Well, and set it up in a way that it is a future tax generator, right? I mean, that is, frankly, I think the goal of any federal stimulus is that ultimately it's supposed to keep taxes flowing, right? Whether it's from, local to state or state to federal, that's how we keep our roads and commodes and all that good stuff up and operating. So one of the just kind of final things that I want to touch base on is kind of along the same vein of maybe some outside of the box and creative thinking. As a federal government, we're hearing a lot right now about additional stimulus money that's coming down the pike. And I think, Luke, actually, you hit on this a little bit earlier. Folks really should be checking for other opportunities that are out there to pay for specific funding. I'm going to pick on broadband just a little bit right now. I realize that it's eligible through ARP funds, but one of the things that folks really should be looking at is if there is infrastructure money coming down the pike, what does the infrastructure money allow for versus the ARP funds? And then making sure that you are paying for things out of the appropriate pot, but not allowing those opportunities to pass you by. If the ARP funds will pay for, the planning or some sort of infrastructure, what piece will the infrastructure bill pay for that is not the same? So that's another potential future creative use of funds and another potential webinar. So there you go. We'll be back when the infrastructure bill passes. So we're coming up on our hour here momentarily. I do just want to remind the audience, if they have any additional questions, we do have about 10 minutes. But I'm going to go ahead and allow what I'd like for our panelists to do is just to provide any last minute words of wisdom, ideas, resources, tips, tricks, frequently asked questions that I haven't hit on, et cetera. So Luke, we'll let you go first this time.
Great. Thanks, Andrea. And, as always, love being with TPMA. So thanks for having me, and thanks for everybody for listening to us for an hour. I love to talk, as you can tell. I would encourage everyone. This is a great opportunity. It's really tight timelines. We didn't really talk about 2024 all that much. It's a lot of money to be spent in that time. And I think there's going to be a big urge to how do we spend this, and let's get it out the door. I would encourage you to slow down, think through it. I do believe there will be changes to the guidelines on spending. as we see what's going on in some of this transportation bill in DC and talking about the leftover money and all those type of things, I just don't think any administration will put themselves in that position again. But we are happy to help you with these conversations, happy to help you with the strategy. And I think what's really cool about this relationship, this world, I think probably people could look at KSM and TPMA and say, hey, they're competition, but that couldn't be further from the truth in our relationship. So we want to help communities grow. We want to help communities use this money in the right way. So if there's ways we can help, please reach out. I know sometimes questions you're like, I don't want to ask that question. I guarantee somebody's wants to ask that question as well. So if you want to reach out to me personally, you want to reach out to Andrea personally, please do it, to Brittany as well. We're all selfish in the way that we want communities across the country to grow and be great places to live and can continue to compete on a world stage. So let's all work together and make sure we're spending this money the best way we can to continue to make everywhere we live a better place.
Oh, that's very well said, Luke. And I do have to say that kind of gets to the heart of, why we're in business. Tom always says that we're a for-profit company with a nonprofit heart. And I think anybody that gets involved in this industry, when you're helping communities and helping public clients, that really is something that does kind of drive you. And then something else that you hit on before I get to you, Brittany, just really quick, Luke. So before I saw a McKinsey article that came out, I want to say like 2 days ago, about taking the long view of how you're going to spend funds. One Thomas P. Miller penned an op-ed that was recently published in the Indiana Business Journal, talking about how important it is that from anything from the Ready Fund, like what you had referenced earlier, Luke, to ARP funds in general, how it's important that we are not just taking let's get this money out the door right now. Let's spend it on this thing that's right in front of us. Let's sit back, take a minute and make some really creative strategic decisions on the long game. So thank you for that. And thank you for your comments. All right, Brittany, how about you? Any closing thoughts, tips, tricks, FAQs?
I think Luke did a great job summarizing it. I think things we said, don't send the money back, try to figure it out. It is a short time frame, but it's also a little bit longer than we've experienced with some of the recent federal funding. So you do have time to understand it and be thoughtful. And I think that's the big thing, is be thoughtful, intentional, strategic with what you want to do, and be forward thinking, not just addressing immediate needs, but thinking, what will your community need more longer term, and how can these funds be used to support those needs and priorities? So just reinforcing everything that's already been said. Yeah,
absolutely. So, Luke, you mentioned this at the very beginning of the call, and that is that there will likely be new guidance, right? From the day that the CARES Fund Act was passed, we saw guidance coming out all the time, FAQs, extensions, you name it. It was coming out. I would agree with you that there's probably going to be something coming down the pike here relatively quickly regarding ARP funds, especially as they continue to not be spent. And I'm sure that the press is going to hit with the $10 billion of additional CARES funds still lingering out there, and probably, motivate some additional ARP guidance and try and get some of that money out the door. So just want to remind our audience, with all of our webinars, we post everything on YouTube. We also send an email follow-up to those who participate so that you can have access to those resources. We'll be sure and include Luke's email in that particular follow-up email, so you can contact him directly and then continue to ask him questions, or TPMA, either way. And then we did actually put a link to the ARP guidance that Brittany referenced at the beginning of the call. It is in the chat, but we'll be sure and send that out via email as well. So I definitely want to thank everybody for joining us today and asking such great questions. And thank you, Luke and Brittany, for your very creative answers and responses. I know doing a live Q&A about anything that has compliance and federal guidance and money is always kind of a nerve-wracking thing, but you guys handled all of the questions fabulously. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.